Oh, I got a ticket. Thank you. Someone gave me a drink ticket. Yeah, I know. All right, my friends, I'm going to ask you to bring it down from lunch. I'm so sorry to everyone in the room because you're already here. Like, I don't need to talk to you. You're here, you're seated, you rock and roll. You can have your side convos. You're actually not who I'm targeting right now. But we're going to bring it back for our afternoon itinerary. We're very soon going to have a keynote, and we're going to have a panel about AI, which is going to be great. And so's our keynote, but I'll just I don't know, give people a second to come back. Hey, how are you?
I'm good, and you?
I'm good.
So,
Are you doing?
actually,
Yes, I saw you setting up. You're just going to use the podium.
yeah.
Great.
Okay. So I wait that you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, my friends, you're not going to want to miss the top of this next keynote. If you are chatting upstairs, I can hear everything you're saying. I'm accessing all your top secret information. I don't even know why I thought that was funny. I see people are coming down the stairs, which is awesome. I just want to do our next speaker justice. I want to tell you all about her just before she comes on the stage. I'm going up the stairs. They're coming? Okay. Well, we're going to get this party started because I will tell you something about Canada that I think needs to change. And it's not a capital P public policy, but it's the social thing we do. It's if and when you go out with your friends, people are very reluctant to order their food until the last person is here. And the server comes and it's like, do you want to order something? I'm like, no, Stacy's on her way. No, that is incorrect. The actual move is when you're going out to meet your friends, you're the first one seated, congratulations. You get a Negroni, you order an appetizer, you read on your phone, you read your book, you just take it all in. And when your friend texts you, oh my God, I'm running late, you don't get mad, you say, no worries. You text them the menu, what can I order you? So that when your friend comes, you have a drink ready. And what we're gonna do right now is we're gonna get a drink ready for the rest of our friends who are upstairs coming downstairs. Marie-Jolie Desrochers is the executive director of the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Experiences. And she's going to speak to us. What are you? What did I say? Oh my gosh. You know what? My reading comprehension. Don't, just kidding. Thank you. I'm so sorry. She's going to speak to us about how the coalition works to protect Canada's cultural sovereignty and diversity of expression online, and also why this matters for democracy. I think we probably have some ideas about that already. And for creativity and for inclusion, and how we get there by regulating platforms and algorithmic systems. Great teaser right ahead of our AI panel. And I hope it's okay if I say this. I do believe it was part of the program that you're going to introduce the idea of art. Not visual art or musical art. And if this is wrong, you can correct me again from the podium, and I'll probably get pulled from being the MC. Authorization, remuneration, and transparency. A framework to ensure that technology supports rather than undermines cultural diversity. I fear, was that a spoiler? You're done. Yeah, no, I'm just kidding. Please welcome our keynote speaker. Okay.
So hello everybody, and I will say something quickly in French. C'est possible que je parle en français pour la dernière partie de mon intervention, et je le fais maintenant en français pour vous encourager à vous lever, à aller chercher les écouteurs. So you should maybe get the headphones if you want to understand the best part of my speech today, which will be at the end, but really in French, to bring a bit of linguistic diversity to the event. So good afternoon, everybody. I start the timer also to make sure we don't stay here until tomorrow. So thank you for this invitation to reflect on cultural sovereignty and to give such a nice place to culture on this stage and at the middle of the day of this great conference. Together, we will do a reflection that is inseparable from the reflections we have on digital sovereignty. It speaks about our vision for the rules and laws that should govern the digital environment. So, as it was said, I am the executive director of the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. The clicker. So, the coalition, for over 25 years, we have brought together on a pan-Canadian scale the major organizations of the audiovisual, book, music, visual arts, digital arts, and the performing arts all together. So you can see our membership. We unite unions, professional associations, and collective management societies in both official language markets, including official language minority communities, both in Quebec and in the rest of Canada. With more than 50 member organizations, we speak on behalf of 350,000 creators, artists, rights holders, and over 3,000 cultural businesses across the country. I therefore speak on behalf of a broad plurality of voices, a huge responsibility. The positions I convey represent a consensus among the members of the CDCE, while respecting sector-specific realities. I always make sure to highlight these specificities so that the collective voice I represent retains all the richness and nuances that make it up. So why a coalition? Let's see. So the PowerPoint is meant to be simple, so you listen to me. The coalition was founded on a simple realization. Economic globalization posed an existential threat to cultural diversity in Canada, but also around the world. Culture is undeniably a driver of economic development, but it cannot be reduced to this dimension alone. However, at the turn of the century, the World Trade Organization, as an international organization with an essentially economic vocation, failed to recognize this dual nature. Back in 1998, this awareness grew urgent enough to bring together representatives from Quebec's cultural and creative industry in a coalition, the coalition I still represent today, and soon after, they convinced their counterparts from across Canada to join them. Political leaders, both federal and from Quebec, quickly recognized the scale and relevance of the movement. For more than 7 years, politicians like Sheila Copps, Lisa Frula, Lynn Beauchamp, and Louise Baudouin rolled up their sleeves and took turns working next to civil society, the coalition, all together. They managed to convince 147 states to adopt a groundbreaking international instrument, which is the UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. It was adopted in 2005 and first ratified in 2007 by a country still recognized today as a global leader in its implementation. And this country was Canada. It was a major diplomatic success, and we still should be proud about that today. In its preamble, so I bring those simple quotes from Sheila Copps in 1999, and that brings us to Stephen Guilbeault in 2025. So Sheila Copps, at the beginning of all this work, said simply, you can simply lump culture in with commodities. Culture is not pork bellies or shoes or goods. So that was really the foundation of the convention. And it brings us to today, but there was also an interesting quote from Pablo Rodriguez, which I removed, where he said, because I thought it's too long, but now you have it. It's an exclusivity. So Pablo Rodriguez, I really like the fact that he said, everything that we have in the cultural sector in Canada did not happen magically. It happened because we did it, because we worked for it. And I think that's what the convention is. So in its preamble, the convention reaffirms the fundamental principles of human rights, the freedom to create, to participate in, and to access the diversity of cultural expressions. Of course, the convention came into being before we collectively grasped the scale of the digital revolution that was emerging at this time, and before we could anticipate the profound transformations brought about by generative artificial intelligence. But in 2005, that transformation was already underway. So the technologically neutral text of the convention makes it, even today, a solid foundation for asserting our cultural sovereignty, even if further action is both possible and necessary to clarify its scope and make it legally binding. I will come back to that at the end. Less than a month ago, on October 20, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of this convention. I was in Aracaju, Brazil, with the International Federation of Coalitions for Cultural Diversity, which I have the honor to serve as Secretary General. And there we brought together coalitions from all regions of the world. The conclusion is clear. Much has been accomplished, but the next few years will be decisive. Oh, can I come back? So there are two key principles drawn directly from the convention that guide my remarks today. First, the dual nature of culture. I touched to it already, but here is what is said in the preamble of the convention. Convinced that cultural activities, goods, and services have both an economic and a cultural nature because they convey identities, values, and meanings, and therefore must not be treated as solely having commercial value. And the second thing is also really important for us. The Article 11 of the Convention says that parties acknowledge the fundamental role of civil society in protecting and promoting the diversity of cultural expressions. The parties shall encourage the active participation of civil society in their efforts to achieve the objective of these conventions. So the Canadian coalition rests on a small but highly dedicated theme supported by a vast and committed membership. Cultural sovereignty can only be built with those who create, produce, and share our works. So what are we talking about when we speak about cultural sovereignty? Over the past month in Canada, the conversation around sovereignty, particularly digital sovereignty, has intensified. We hear about autonomy, control, the capacity to act. In the cultural realm, cultural sovereignty simply refers to our ability to legislate within our territory to ensure that the widest possible diversity of voices, ideas, and expressions can flourish, offline and online alike. Recently, I heard a speaker say that for him, protecting and promoting the diversity of cultural expressions mean acting to preserve voices that are in danger of disappearing. It's an interesting avenue, but one that needs to be completed. In every society, voices are subject to different dynamics, political, economic, linguistic, which result in them being put forward or, on the contrary, set aside. In Canada, we can easily think of Indigenous cultures and languages, of our two official languages, of the voices of Black and racialized people, those of the two LGBTQ+ people, people with disability, and other marginalized groups. So to protect and promote cultural diversity, therefore, is to strive for equity, to support diverse cultural ecosystem, to ensure viable socioeconomic conditions for creators and for those who support them, to preserve freedom of artistic and expressive activity, and to guarantee public access to a rich and varied cultural offering. In light of past few months, so why does it matter what we do? In light of the past few months, one might be tempted to answer simply, and we do that a lot at the coalition, because we are not the 51st state. Yes, but defining ourselves solely by what we are not remains insufficient. We are a plural society shaped by diverse stories, paths, and territories. The diversity of our cultural expressions tells our stories and connects us to one another. It nurtures democracy and combats polarization. And if that alone is not convincing, let me emphasize the economic significance of the sector. According to a study released in October 2025, Canada's cultural sector contributed to $65 billion to the national economy, representing 2% of Canada's nominal GDP and supporting 1.1 million jobs across the country. More jobs per $1 million of production than sectors such as trade, construction, agriculture, manufacturing, or oil and gas. So how this translates into concrete action? We're coming to the AI stuff. But let's begin with our core mission, trade agreement. So to protect culture in trade agreement, and right now, most notably within CUSMA. In all trade negotiation, the coalition advocates for a comprehensive cultural exemption, that is, the systematic exclusion of culture from trade commitments to preserve the necessary latitude for adopting appropriate cultural policies. It is this very flexibility that has historically enabled quotas and preferential treatment for Canadian or Francophone content. In CUSMA, our most significant agreement in terms of cultural sovereignty, Canada succeeded in maintaining, at the last review, a broad cultural exemption. However, with the United States and Mexico, this exemption has always came with the right of retaliation. So far, neither partner country has exercised this right. But, given the current context, heightened vigilance is required. It is in this spirit that last July, the coalition sent a letter to Prime Minister Carney to reaffirm that culture must remain untouchable in the context of the review of the CUSMA. This vigilance was echoed on October 7, when the Minister of Canadian Identity and Culture, Mr. Stephen Guilbeault, publicly stated that culture is not and will not be on the table. We know it won't be on the Canadian side, but we can't wait to see what will happen if someone brings it. That is encouraging, but we remain cautious. Beyond the general exemption and the right of retaliation, which have historically held our attention, we are now paying particular attention to everything related to digital trade and, of course, artificial intelligence in trade agreement, because cultural industries are now fundamentally inseparable from it. This rapid technological development requires that our commitments and measures, both internationally and nationally, be updated so that they remain relevant and can effectively safeguard Canada's cultural industries and cultural diversity. So let's come to the cultural policies, and most specifically about the Online Streaming Act. So maybe I switch to French just a little to see if you are awake. Alors, dès la fin des années 90, les industries culturelles ont milité pour une modernisation du cadre réglementaire de la radiodiffusion canadienne. Le CRTC, toutefois, a longtemps résisté. Dans deux célèbres décisions rendues en 1999 et en 2009, il a choisi d'exempter les nouveaux médias afin de favoriser l'innovation, créant 2 décennies d'asymétrie en défaveur de l'écosystème canadien. Ce n'est qu'en avril 2023 que la modernisation de la loi sur la radiodiffusion est enfin survenue, intégrant les plateformes de diffusion continue en ligne, incluant celles non canadiennes, dans notre système de radiodiffusion. Cette loi habilitante confère au CRTC le pouvoir de développer des réglementations tenant compte de chacun des types d'entreprises et de services qu'il régule, tout en restant fondée sur les 2 piliers historiques sur lesquels nous avons bâti notre écosystème de radiodiffusion, financer et mettre en valeur le contenu canadien. Depuis son adoption en 2023, le CRTC enchaîne les consultations. Le 4 juin 2024, une première décision majeure a été rendue, exigeant une contribution financière initiale de 5 % des revenus canadiens des grandes plateformes au secteur audio et audiovisuel dès 2024-2025. Mais cette décision a aussitôt été contestée par les plateformes et nous sommes toujours en attente de la décision. D'autres décisions cruciales sont aussi en attente de la part du CRTC. On parle de découvrabilité, de la définition du contenu canadien, de la protection de certains genres audiovisuels. audiovisuelle. Ce sont toutes des décisions qui auront une importance majeure pour notre souveraineté culturelle dans les prochaines années. Mais il faut encore faire preuve de patience pour mesurer pleinement les impacts véritables de la modernisation de notre loi sur la radiodiffusion. Et maintenant, l'éléphant dans la pièce, l'intelligence artificielle générative. On entend parfois que l'IA générative chamboule notre conception de l'art, de la création et de l'originalité. Mon message est simple. Qu'ils adoptent l'IA, l'expérimentent à l'occasion ou s'en tiennent à distance, nos créateurs, nos créatrices savent toujours ce que ces mots veulent dire. Écoutons-les. Nous avons mis 20 ans à commencer à réguler les plateformes en ligne. On nous répétait que l'innovation et la souveraineté culturelle seraient incompatibles. Apprenons de cette expérience. Les deux peuvent marcher main dans la main. Ne nous leurrons pas. Le discours sur l'innovation à tout prix, le fameux « move fast and break things », demeure un discours dominant. Nous avons même vu au Canada la création d'un poste de ministre de l'Intelligence artificielle et de l'Innovation numérique. Je ne vous cacherai pas qu'au sein du milieu culturel, nous avons accueilli cela avec des points d'interrogation. Quelles seront ses responsabilités? Est-ce qu'on parle d'innovation, de régulation? Comment concilier le travail d'un ministre de l'Industrie, d'un ministre de l'Intelligence artificielle avec le travail d'un ministre de la Culture et de l'Identité canadienne? Nous faisons le pari de l'optimisme. Nous avons sollicité une rencontre avec l'honorable Evan Solomon et nous avons passé un peu plus d'1 heure avec lui en présence de 12 membres de la coalition pour une discussion assez productive. C'était le 8 octobre dernier, et pour clôturer cette discussion, le ministre a publié par lui-même sur une plateforme de réseau social « Culture is at the heart of what it means to be Canadian ». Alors, on espère que c'est ce message qui continuera de guider les actions de notre gouvernement. Parce que le vol massif de la propriété intellectuelle de nos ayants droit, qui constitue aussi notre richesse collective, est intolérable. Alors, on m'avait un peu scoopé. Notre demande en matière d'intelligence artificielle se résume facilement par cet acronyme. ART, autorisation, rémunération, transparence, qui a en plus la qualité d'être presque parfaitement bilingue. Concrètement, notre loi sur le droit d'auteur au Canada n'autorise pas la fouille de textes et données sans autorisation. Nous ne sommes pas aux États-Unis, où l'exception pour le fair use est invoquée par les entreprises d'intelligence artificielle pour légitimer leur utilisation non consentie et non rémunérée d'œuvres protégées. C'est d'ailleurs sujet de plusieurs poursuites en ce moment et il faudra suivre ce qui va arriver avec les décisions. Nous ne sommes pas non plus dans l'Union européenne, où une malheureuse exception permettant la fouille de textes et données a été introduite en 2019. Cette exception fait peser un fardeau indu sur les ayants droit et fait d'ailleurs encore l'objet de plusieurs discussions. Nous sommes au Canada, où nous avons en place une loi qui fonctionne par opt-in. Si on veut utiliser les données d'un ayant droit, les œuvres protégées d'un ayant droit, on doit demander la permission. Et même si nous ne sommes pas en Australie, dans ce cas-ci, j'espère que nous saurons nous inspirer de cet exemple positif, puisqu'il y a quelques semaines, le gouvernement australien a affirmé qu'il n'introduira pas d'exception pour la fouille de textes et données. Ne pas avoir d'exception pour la FTD est une condition essentielle pour permettre le développement d'un marché de licence. Nos sociétés de gestion de collectives canadiennes s'y préparent. Avec un marché de licence, on peut demander le consentement et on peut verser une rémunération. En outre, notre loi reconnaît par le biais de différents critères que le droit d'auteur a pour vocation d'inciter à la création humaine. Nous nous opposons à l'octroi de droits pour des produits purement ou substantiellement générés par l'IA. Donc, pour résumer, en matière de droit d'auteur et IA, notre demande est simple. Ne faites rien. La loi est robuste. Elle a d'autres défauts, c'est important pour moi de le dire, parce qu'il y a certaines choses qu'on aimerait voir corrigées dans la loi sur le droit d'auteur, mais ce n'est pas en lien avec l'intelligence artificielle. Protéger ce socle, c'est permettre le déploiement d'une solution de marché qui permettra l'autorisation et la rémunération. Par contre, on attend des actions quand même. On espère qu'une loi générale sur l'intelligence artificielle permettra des dispositions en matière de transparence. Pour pouvoir mettre en place un marché de licence, on doit pouvoir avoir des obligations de divulgation des œuvres qui ont été utilisées pour entraîner les systèmes d'IA. Il faut aussi mettre en place des obligations de transparence pour que le public soit averti lorsqu'il consomme des produits purement ou substantiellement générés par l'IA, comme on a pu voir, par exemple, sur Amazon, des livres purement générés par IA qui trompent le public, ou encore sur Spotify, un pourcentage effarant de musique purement générée par IA qui est maintenant offerte dans des listes de lecture pour verser moins de redevances aux ayants droit. Tout cela est à portée de main, mais la tempête de l'IA, qui porte autant de promesses que de menaces, ne fait que commencer. Même si on fait ce qu'on demande aujourd'hui, l'IA va continuer de bouleverser nos industries culturelles. Il faut mettre en place un système de gouvernance qui inclut les voix des créateurs, des créatrices et des entreprises culturelles de façon systématique. En septembre dernier, j'étais présente à Mondiaculte, la plus grande conférence mondiale sur les politiques culturelles organisée par l'UNESCO. On y a retrouvé plus de 120 ministres de la culture. Bien sûr, Steven Guilbeault était présent. Pendant 3 jours, j'ai entendu des ministres de la culture de partout dans le monde, les uns après les autres, reconnaître les atteintes causées par le développement sans balises de l'IA générative à la diversité des expressions culturelles. Un document final contenant 4 pages d'engagement a été signé par l'ensemble des ministres présents. On peut notamment y lire que tous s'engagent à promouvoir une approche de l'environnement numérique centrée sur l'humain, fondée sur les droits humains, respectueuse des droits culturels, qui favorise l'équité et l'accessibilité, qui valorise la diversité des expressions culturelles. Les engagements existent. Il faut désormais les traduire en normes contraignantes dans l'environnement numérique. Dans les nombreux cadres et déclarations qui prennent forme partout dans le monde pour une IA de confiance, sécuritaire, etc., les mentions sur la diversité des expressions culturelles demeurent trop timides. Le Canada, chef de file historique dans la protection et la promotion de la diversité culturelle, doit demeurer à l'avant de la parade. Au plan national, j'ai décrit les chantiers prioritaires. À l'international, il faut intensifier la diplomatie pour favoriser des cadres en faveur de la culture. C'est pourquoi la CEDEC, la coalition, soutient l'ajout d'un protocole contraignant à la Convention de 2005, comme l'ont recommandé en décembre dernier 18 experts et expertes mandatés par l'UNESCO pour réfléchir à cette question. La Convention de 2005 est technologiquement neutre, certes, mais le développement sans concertation de cadres nationaux pour l'environnement numérique et l'IA générative, alors que les modèles d'affaires des entreprises sont mondiaux, plaide en faveur d'un instrument international normatif contraignant. La culture ne peut plus être une arrière-pensée. En cette époque particulière où comprendre notre identité et celle de l'autre, redéfinir notre relation à nos voisins et aux pays qui sont plus loin est une priorité. Le secteur culturel, où le Canada est reconnu comme un joueur d'influence, est un atout que nous devons à tout prix mettre de l'avant. Je vous remercie. Et je peux prendre quelques questions, je crois, de nous deux.
I think you have a moment for questions. Let me see both timers. Yeah, you have 45 seconds.
There's one. Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts on like CIGF and like CIGF and similar methods of cryptographically like embedding inside the metadata of images, for example, that are generated by AI or videos that are generated by AI, so that we can like find their provenance. If that's something that you have any thoughts on, and if there's anything that are involved in those sorts of things to kind of standardize them.
So I'm not sure I heard everything, but you speak about technological ways of attributing the work.
Provenance of AI-generated images and video.
Well, we are interested in any technical progress. It is not our core business to find the technical ways of making the principle adopted, if I can say. But we have members that are really looking, I will say mostly collective management society, like SOCAN, for instance, are really involved in this kind of work.
Thank you so much. Let the conversation continue after our next panel when we take another break. And thank you so much again for your lovely keynote. And for the work that you're doing. panel, you're going to be in great hands with Victoria Cuquez, whose name I probably also said incorrectly. She's amazing. She's doing some really great work. She's a 2025 Obama Foundation Scholar, and she's the Director of Corporate Engagement at Catalyst. And what Victoria is going to take us through is a panel I think we've been dancing towards all day in ways big and small, which is talking about the next frontier of digital policy and getting a bit more into the nitty-gritty around AI governance. On that panel with her, we have Mark Sean, the Associate Deputy Minister or Unassociate Deputy Minister at ICED, Ashley Casanovan, the Managing Director of IAPP's Governance Center, and Jackson Khan, a Senior Fellow at the Monk School at the University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming them, and off you go. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Vass. And is this on?
I think you don't have to touch it. It'll get there.
It'll just get there. Oh, there it is. So first of all, you said my name correctly. Thank you. I appreciate it. But thank you to Vass, and thank you to Sarah and the whole CIGF for having us here today, and also for the really brilliant conversations we've had all day. I think it's been provocative. It hasn't been what we've been hearing at all the other conferences. It really feels like a continuation. And so with that, we have some pretty incredible visionary minds here who are at the forefront of, the question we're asking today. And to really drive into that, our objective is to explore how governments can balance the drive for innovation with the need for digital protections. But the truth of the matter is that we're in a different time. This is not the same conversation as last year. This is a very different moment for all of us, and we're looking at what's on the frontier in a changing global landscape, what questions we need to be asking, and most importantly, what actions do we need to be taking. So with that, I'm going to start with Mark. Mark, we're in a powerful moment of self-determination for Canada. So I want to ask, how does Canada stay competitive on the global stage amidst varying international approaches to AI regulation? What's the right mix of protecting rights and promoting innovation, especially with all the changes in the US context?
So an easy question
Yeah,
to start.
just,
Thanks.
simple
Yeah.
ones to ask.
First of all, un grand merci à CIGF pour l'invitation et à Sierra pour son organisation de cette conférence. Thanks everyone for the invite today. It's a loaded question, but an important one. And so I'll try and kind of unpack a few things that I think are important. If Canada is to be relevant in an AI-driven world, it means we need to be understanding and using the technology. And so I think a core component of our leadership has to be that we continue to understand the nature of this technology and that we are continuing to push for its safe, responsible, and thoughtful diffusion, particularly in places where it can actually impact Canada's societal, economic, and global outcomes in terms of what it can contribute to the world, but also how it can contribute to itself. And so I think we have lots on the table in terms of the ways in which we're trying to make sure that this isn't a technology that is understood in its abstract or that is kind of over there as something that kind of is, but is actually something that for which we are doing. Fundamental to the doing is obviously, three things that really drive artificial intelligence, which is data, people, and power. We can probably think about those in their broadest sense, in the sense that, and so I think on the data side, trying to think about how we assert ourselves as effective and efficient users of data. And that probably means a couple of things. One is, my minister, Minister Solomon, who's the Minister of Artificial Intelligence and Digital Innovation, has noted his commitment to moving forward on private sector privacy reform. Third time's the charm. And I think that offers a really unique opportunity to be able to ensure that there is actual trust and thoughtfulness around the use of personal information by private sector actors, and that we are aligned and allow for data flows in an international context. And I think, the fact that we actually can continue to contribute to global commerce as information moves throughout and across, I think is important. But then I think we also need to be good stewards of our own data and thoughtful ways in which we can bring data to its own advantage. And I think there are spaces for which Canada is a massive repository of really important data sets that I don't think we are currently maximizing to their full potential. On people, I think this is about the skills and upskilling opportunity that exists in an AI-driven workforce. I think the reality is that the best way to get to a augmentation over displacement is by upskilling and actually ensuring that people have the capabilities to be able to engage. Fundamental to that, important to this audience, is obviously the ability to connect, which is the start, and before you even get to any of those other pieces. And then on power, I think there's a couple of ways in which I kind of play that function. So one is like pure power, which is just literally the grid and off-grid opportunities to be able to put that to work for AI. We've been deploying a $2 billion sovereign infrastructure envelope now since Jackson helped get it in the budget in 2024, and so. And I think are making thoughtful choices about how we can actually build digital resilience for Canada, which I think is a fundamental piece of our global leadership, is how will we actually have strategic autonomy to be able to enter into partnership and cooperation with our key allies. And I think that we have to do that from a place of strength, and that place of strength has to include a digital backbone that actually allows us to be able to do that. But I think there's also power in other places, and I think Ashley will get very excited if I say these words, and so I'll just tease them, and then we can come back to them, which is, we are probably at a moment right now where we were on an arc towards kind of some form of interoperable global governance over artificial intelligence. We started that already in 2017 when we had our first AI strategy. We, as Canada, not just the government, but Canada was responsible for helping shepherd the Montreal Declaration on Responsible AI, one of the kind of earliest intentions at the kind of norm level and ethics level. And then, through GPA and through cooperation through the safety institutes and through work in the G7, we were on this nice kind of path that seemed like it was sort of trending towards like what will be shared regulatory and statutory obligations. And then the world wasn't kind of moving towards that direction. And so where I think that leaves us right now is to use our power towards technocratic cooperation, often below the radar, often below the line, but that actually advances evaluation science, that actually advances assessment capacities, standards, certifications, codes. These are spaces where I think Canada can lead, notwithstanding the fact that we might not be presiding over the gaveling of a brand new international order that says we all now agree on how we think about this general purpose technology, and that we've all agreed to have an interoperable regime for how we're going to regulate it.
I think that's a really helpful first statement to get us going here, and thinking about the framework of people, power, and data, I think sets us up well for this conversation. Jackson, I do want to ask you about sovereign AI, given that this has been our frame, I think, for much of the day, but I did want to get a sense of the same question, of your answer for the same question. So, essentially, what do you think in terms of how Canada can stay competitive on the global stage, given the current geopolitical and global context?
Thanks so much, Victoria, and also everyone here for coming together on this exciting topic. Mark laid out a great frame, and Mark, I was lucky enough to learn from and work with Mark briefly at ISED. Now I'm at the University of Toronto, so looking forward to connecting with folks again here. My gosh, sovereign AI, what does this mean? This is the big question, I think, before us. I think, over the last few weeks, I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I've heard data sovereignty, cloud sovereignty, AI sovereignty, sovereign AI. I mean, the Globe and Mail wrote a piece saying that we've reached the point of semantic satiation, where these words have just been said over and over again to the point, like, what the heck does sovereignty even mean, right? It's almost become just this word that's not even useful at the current context. Obviously, it's important, but I try and drill it down to what actually matters, right? And right now, we're kind of faced with this geopolitical environment where we're going to have to make choices. Like, we can't do everything under the sun that we would need to I think, create the ideal future that we would likely want, but we have limited resources, right? And so, if we think about where we're at as a country, economically, the country's trying to make choices about major projects. Here are things that we can invest in that we think will actually drive the economic outcomes we need to see to preserve our social safety net and avoid getting absorbed, into a regime which maybe we don't agree with, right? On the digital governance side and the digital sovereignty side, what I think matters is we can't own the entire supply chain, right? We're not going to go and start making NVIDIA level chips in Canada tomorrow. These are things that have taken decades of profound investments, which, obviously the fabrication of are headquartered in Taiwan, extremely hard to replicate. But there are things that we could own from an infrastructure perspective in Canada that could actually make a difference to protect our sovereignty, make sure we have more control, right? Let's think about those. One is, the AI models themselves. We don't have one of the largest AI companies in the world in Canada, but we do have Cohere, which is actually competitive, right? It is able to produce enterprise AI, which could be used by institutions in our country to create models that are, free from coercion. We could actually build and have control and develop data sets that can be useful. I think about things that we want to protect, things like our health data, right? Canada actually has some of the most diverse health data in the world from the different population sets that we have in our country. That could be really cool, and that's not just good to protect it, but it's also an exportable asset. So again, it's something that we could be competitive on. Like, this is something that we could actually own, and by doing that and by developing it, it actually does help to protect our sovereignty because we have control over that part of the technology. We're not just promoting our sovereignty through regulatory development, we're promoting it through industrial development. So that's what I think about. It's like, how do we own and actually operate some of the aspects there? Something else I think about too is, and not to go too hard on industrial policy, but I think about satellites. I don't know if anybody else saw the Wired report that came out in the past couple of weeks, but they basically said that 50% of the traffic from satellites is actually flowing out unencrypted. That's crazy, right? And so one of the questions is, is that a part of the supply chain, or I guess the supply chain of digital control that Canada could own? Maybe not entirely, but we actually do have the capacity to build and manufacture satellites in the country. We actually do have Telesat, which is building, a low Earth orbit satellite framework similar to SpaceX. And so these are like sovereign components that we could actually control. And the last thing I'll just leave you with on the governance side, Mark laid out a number of different developments that are happening. One I think about too is, again, we can't replicate all of this stuff, but there may be places where it makes sense to have resilient infrastructure, right? Let's say in the context of a trade war, someone decided to turn off or throttle some aspects of our access to advanced storage, cloud storage, or access to advanced AI models. That would slow down our productivity. That would slow down our economic engine as a country, and that could potentially harm our citizens and our people in Canada. And so do we have resilient backups that are Canadian control within Canadian jurisdiction? And thinking about the tiers of that, like what absolutely needs to be super sovereign, whatever the heck that means. But it is, absolute sovereignty, things like our national security. And then there's maybe jurisdictional sovereignty, so things like, again, health and financial systems. And then there's probably the vast amount of this data and these systems that could be, in traditional cloud storage, hyperscalers, whatever that may be. But it's really thinking about a tiered approach here. And I think that's how I think about sovereign AI and sovereign data. Yeah.
That's really helpful, actually, and that builds off really well around the panel, what we heard this morning from Vass and Michael Geist and the others. So appreciate you carrying it forward there. Ashley, I do want to talk to you about cultural transformation a little bit, but before we go into that, I also wanted to just a quick round to ask all of you, wondering how you're feeling and what you're particularly encouraged by in the budget that we saw. Jackson, do you want to continue, and then we can go over to Mark and then Ashley?
I feel encouraged within the budget that the government is looking into using AI across the government to make it more efficient. I think we are doing light touch stuff in the budget until there's an AI strategy in place, which probably makes sense. Hey, let's go and do a consultation publicly. That sounds like a great idea. And then we get a lot of inputs, and then we formulate what does that look like for the future. I think if I was to look at it in isolation, there's only minor additions from a financial perspective to, let's say, the sovereign cloud. At this point, I think it was only 125 million extra. The reason that fund came about in the first place was not for Canada to go and put in, $50 billion into building out replications of stuff that already exists, right? Cloud that already exists in other formats. But it was, how do you have a strategic reserve of compute that we own, we do control? I think that's a good thing. Where I would like to see more, I think, in the future is along these topics. It's like, okay, well, if we're going to go and do sovereign cloud, like, let's be really, really specific about the definitions. Where I think we could get stuck, I could see 7 out of 10 different outcomes of where this could actually be bad or even counterproductive for the country, right? If we go and build a bunch of stuff that, for example, no one uses. Or no one needs, right? And so being really, really specific about the requirements, I think, is important. And then I think on the budget, limited language on the regulation side, but I'll just maybe go back to what Mark said. Like, I think the minister has forecasted a pretty clear signal. They're going to go big on the privacy legislation side, which I got to work on take 2 of that. I'm hopeful that take 3 is successful, but I do think privacy ledge is still the biggest thing that we could do to make sure that AI is mostly used responsibly. And I think there's a lot of other aspects there related to copyright that'll be good. The last thing I'll just quickly say in terms of the budget, the specific question, procurement is a very good way to do this, right, is to actually improve our sovereignty as a country. Again, develop and own the technology where it's important here in Canada with the players that matter. Too often, I think we've been playing a Boy Scout game where we play by the fairest rules possible when in reality other countries around the world are not doing so. They are choosing their own providers, they are setting the rules, and they do that through the course of setting supplier requirements. So having more control over that part of the supply chain, I know that Ashley's very excited to get in here and talk about standards, but setting those standards in the procurement side, I think it's an area of soft law where we can have a huge amount of impact about what actually happens in our country when the government is the buyer.
Well, since I think there's a natural through line to Ashley, do you want to weigh in a little bit on what you were encouraged by in the budget, and then we'll come to Mark.
Yeah, I think that recognizing this digital transformation office, I don't know what it's going to be called, apologies, but I think that that's something that's recognizing that government has a lot of power, both in terms of procurement or as a purchaser, but also just as a demonstration, I think, to some of the comments that Jackson was already making in terms of how AI can be used, how it can be built for government as a large service provider to the public, but also as demonstrating or setting a tone for what's being used in Canada. I also think that that can help provide a lot of insight into use. Clearly, I'm getting a reputation here for standards, which is not wrong. But I do think that the more information that we have in terms of, again, eating our own food is something that can really help us develop requirements external. And then obviously building upon what Mark already said earlier, having an understanding that power is such an important component of how we just need to stay engaged in the game. Like, it's not, I don't think we're trying to, a lot of interesting actually dynamics going on here, like version 2 of a lot of work that Jackson played a really strong leadership role in, and Mark did as well, with the previous, with under Minister Champagne, is I think we were really trying to win the AI game in the race. And I think that the tone that was set in the budget and in some of the conversations that I think Minister Solomon's been having generally around AI has been recognizing where Canada can play a role, being more strategic about that. And I think that's really part of what I was really happy to see, is that we're not trying to get into this AI arms race with China and the US and others, but thinking about how we can form strategic alliances, where we can strategically get engaged. And I'm, of course, very, very happy to see standards be part of that conversation, which I hope we do get into more, because I think it's a perfect example of where conventionally Canada's had a very strong soft power role that we can continue to build on.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, as a senior public servant, I'm obviously agnostic on the budget. Or at least publicly so. I privately, you can mine my brain for what I think, but maybe just as to use the opportunity and the platform to say some things that I think are notable in the budget. I think the memorandums of understanding capacity for the Minister of Artificial Intelligence and Digital Innovation on digital infrastructure are important. I think we have seen and now know in pretty decent understanding what happens when the pure market gets involved in digital infrastructure as it relates to artificial intelligence, which is to allocate the largest and most aggregate amount of resource to the most efficient user of that volume, which means if you are going to go to the lengths of actually having the economies of scale of creating gigawatts worth of energy, you're going to want to, in pure market terms, allocate that to someone who can most efficiently utilize a gigawatt worth of energy. And there are only a very, very, very limited number of people who can actually do that. And so essentially, I think what the budget recognizes is that left solely to the market, we won't actually trend towards a more sovereign alternative, and we probably won't actually have access to artificial intelligence capacity from an infrastructure perspective that meets the needs of the vast majority of the Canadian economies and Canadian society's users, because their workloads are lumpy, their workloads are episodic, their workloads are often disaggregated and often really lacking a service layer that actually makes sense of what it is that they want to do with artificial intelligence. It's the reason why in our traditional data center propositions for the academic community, we created the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, was because someone actually needs to go through the process of pulling in all of the academic workloads for data purposes, prioritizing them, and then allocating them efficiently into a data center, because it turns out servers and racks aren't really great at saying like, well, it's okay that you only want to use me every second Thursday and that you might come back with a new idea in 3 weeks, and maybe I'll just reserve you some space for that when you've actually had that thought. And so, I think what the MOU process and the budget allows for us to do is to push the arc towards more usable capacity, and then also to trend it towards a more sovereign nature, which is who's the capital that's actually providing for and who gets paid when the new asset gets used, who's providing the power, who's building the shell, whose hardware is in that building. And we always think about just chips, but hardware goes well beyond chips. Hardware includes servers and racks and HVAC and a whole bunch of other really fundamental hardware that drives a data center. Then whose software, which everyone always just thinks about models, but it's not just models. There's actually integration and there's a whole bunch of other things. And then whose workloads. And I think, to Jackson's point earlier, like, the likelihood we're going to be able to win on all of that entirety of that stack is not our current situation. And so I think the capacity, though, towards trending the market towards that kind of alternative is really important. Only other thing I'd say that I think is also really important is artificial intelligence just in general appears 115 times in the budget. Interestingly, mostly in the sections dedicated to each department's use of the comprehensive expenditure review, which is its own thing, but I think generally suggests that we are recognizing the power and potential of this technology, and that we get a moment now that we can harness it effectively, both within the public service, but also externally, and ideally also in the most responsible and thoughtful way.
Thanks for that, Mark. That was, I think that gives us a lot to dive into across this panel. But I want to go now from the technical to the cultural a little bit more, because this panel obviously asks us what's the next frontier for digital policy. But as you said, across the entire budget, AI is everywhere, and it is pervasive in everything. And so, Ashley, the panel is obviously asking us to look at the transformative potential of AI, but we still know the trust gap looms large for all Canadians. So what's required of Canadian leadership to move the needle on adoption? And what does it actually mean to build cooperation on this in the public interest?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think that even just going back to Mark's 3 components there, people being a really important pillar of that. But we break that down. I think we need to then break that down even further, which is looking at when we talk about people and in the way. Sure, technical. Like, yes, we have the need to have technical resources and skills for all of the reasons that we just mentioned. We need to have the people in place that are thinking about their use and application, whether it's in or for government or external. We need to have the people that are developing and thinking about policies related to all of this work. We also then have the general populace that these systems are being used on behalf of. And I don't know that we have a direct correlation with all of those different types of profiles, roles, people, to then the work that's being done. And I think that's where these gaps of trust come from, is that when we look even back to in 2018, there was survey data that was done by Ipsos on trust in AI systems or digital systems, because it was actually broader than AI. And even then we saw that people do not trust the adoption or increased adoption of tools like AI because they don't know how they're being used. And what was most interesting about that survey from my perspective is that the more that it mattered was kind of their sentiment from this, the less trust that they had. And so when we say things like the more that it matters, we're talking about things that could be and have been talked about in other types of legislative discussions related to AI, as in high risk or high impact. But that actually means things like using it in ways that are going to increase have better service provision. So whether that's for healthcare, whether that's for making it easier to cross the border, whether that's making it easier for people to feel safe in their communities, these are all things that are requiring what we in policy land have been categorizing as high risk. And so I think that recognizing that AI is not one monolithic thing, that there's many, many different uses and applications. We've kind of talked about the breakdown of different types of technology. I really appreciate that Mark said it's not just about the models, it's around the context of the model and the technologies, different types of technologies being used. But we're not still having a conversation about the application of these technologies and then talking about the impacted parties from those technologies. So how is AI being used? What are the components of that AI? Therefore, what types of risks does that bring? And then creating various different types of mitigation measures for that. And that's why, for those of you that don't know me, the inside joke on standards is that I worked within Treasury Board Secretariat previously to develop the Directive on Automated Decision-Making Systems. This was a one-size-fits-all policy for government's use of AI systems. In that, we were asked when consulting on it, okay, well, what does good look like in my context? Well, good in the context of using AI for benefits delivery is a very different thing than train derailment monitoring, and it's a very different thing than suicide prevention. And these are all things that the government does. And again, many, many of these things being risky and therefore requiring trust in order that that's going to be deployed in an impactful, effective way, also privacy preserving. And so the thread through all of this is that we can't keep talking about AI in 2025 going on to 2026 as if it's just one thing, and therefore thinking that the community or the public that doesn't trust it is just all of a sudden going to be like, yep, we agree with this. And so then that bucket of mitigation measures, once we understand that, does range. Following my work at Treasury Board Secretariat, I got really involved in technical standards to address that question of, okay, well, what does good look like for these different types of applications? Turns out that's hard. Is it Government of Canada's job to do that? Is it the community's job to do that? TBD, we still don't have an answer on that. But that is something that I think as a AI governance ecosystem, we really, really need to resolve so that we can figure out even how are we developing different mitigation measures, whether that be in the form of technical standards or standards for people. Just one then really quick thing on this, what I'm doing now is I work within an organization, a professional association for digital governance professionals, starting with the privacy community, so very happy to hear about privacy reform. That said, in absence of this clarity, there really needs to be people that are the ones that are navigating, that have the knowledge and competency to navigate all of the grayness in this space. And so when we talk about people, we have to remember that it's not just technical skills that need to be upskilled, it's governance skills that also need to be upskilled to understand, for people both writing the policy but implementing policy in these organizations, they're really being asked to be those gatekeepers or guardians of trust within their organizations. And that's not a small job, and we have to provide resources and appropriate upskilling for that to happen.
I think you raise a lot of important points, and it's actually going to make me break character as a moderator for a second and maybe share a story that I think is important. As we talk about all of these principles and values and work that's being done, we also need to talk about how we actually do it in practice and at the community level, right? So very quickly, I've scaled a career from being a nonpartisan democratic engagement educator and capacity builder at the grassroots community level, and essentially scaled a career in public policy, leadership and in think tanks. But in seeing all these issues that we see and trust, I actually decided to partner, and I'm going to give her a shout out because she's here in the room, with Anna Yan and Shingai Manjengwa at Mila. And I went to them and I said, we know the trust gap is real. how do we actually create a workshop where we can have Canadian workers come and do something where they can map out their work processes, learn some prompts, and actually empower them to start to operate at the top of their job description, rather than shying away from adoption, rolling their eyes about what it might mean for their, companies, their organizations, and ultimately what it means for their futures too. We just had a moment where we invited 300 women in this case, because the data point around adoption is very, very low for women in the workplace, especially when it comes to women being somewhat fearful to try an unknown in a setting that they're being essentially judged upon and stepping out of their comfort zones. So we basically had 300 women in a workshop who were able to do this and then play around with these prompts and leave feeling empowered to try it out some more. And so I feel like, the next part of the conversation that I want to gear things towards is how do we actually create a culturally innovative mindset across Canada, not just in terms of public policy and digital policy, but in terms of how we can have that next set of breakthrough innovators where people know that the future might be uncertain in some ways, but are, feeling fired up to do their part and to be at the forefront of it rather than at the receiving end of it. And so that's my little segue for a moment. But Jackson, before I go back to the scheduled questions, I do want to pick your brain a little bit because you've obviously made an exit from government and you're doing quite a bit of consulting with industry. I'm wondering, how do you think about, as you're advising your clients, how do you think about this cultural mindset of innovation and the work that you're doing outside now?
Yeah, 100%. And great conversation happening up here. I think a few things stand out. One is from the survey data that we did do when I was in government, at one point it was 71% of Canadians would trust AI a heck of a lot more if there were appropriate risk regulations on it, right? And so that's, I think, 20 percentage points higher than I think a comparable stat in the US. And so to some extent, it seems like culturally as Canadians, we feel like we need a bit more permission to feel comfortable to adopt a new technology, maybe one as powerful as this. So that's like one data point in my mind. The second is one of the clients I work with, we surveyed a bunch of their clients, went out this summer, and what we found was a lot of Canadian firms, even though we actually have a lot of great talent, we have access to the technology, don't seem to be able to imagine the possibilities of what they can do with AI in the same way. And so when we compared ourselves to other jurisdictions, it was, Canadians are deploying AI in more narrow use cases. And when they do find those use cases, they go less deep. They stick in the pilot phase, right? And so we have this imagination gap or this ambition deficit, whatever we want to call it as a country, to actually pick something and then go for it. I think that clearly speaks to the trust gap that Ashley raised. I think it also points to this regulatory vacuum that we still have. It's not like we have zero laws that are applicable to AI in this country, but the fact of the matter is we try to pass kind of a broad-based horizontal AI bill. It didn't get passed. And so what does that leave us with? We have some consumer protection legislation. We have 25-year-old privacy laws at the federal level. And so if we don't solve some of this gap soon, it might continue to actually hold back our adoption as a country. And so when I go to clients, what I say, and I particularly consult in between the academic and the corporate sector, a lot of it is people are, I think 1/3 of the people in the rooms I even talk to have never even used AI. They maybe thrown one sentence at ChatGPT. So that's a huge amount of folks who are just scared to even touch the tech. And then the other 2/3 kind of vary. It's like one-third of those folks might be, yeah, I'm actually really, really excited to do more, but I can't. My organization isn't letting me. And then the last third is, they're kind of stuck in the middle where they see the applications, but they really need some help on like use case development, moving that to a proof of concept. And so I think we basically, a couple things. Like one is, why do we not have a national literacy program in place on AI? That just seems like low-hanging fruit.
Absolutely.
The U.S. government, they're doing a lot of things very interestingly, but one thing they did really well was a national executive order on K-12 education. I'm really worried. I just had a baby girl this summer, so my wife and I are very happy. But I'm also very worried about the fact that, where is she going to go to school? Is she going to start learning about this stuff at age 5 or not? Because right now I don't feel like that's very promising, what she's heading into. So that's something that's top of mind for me is on the literacy side. And then the last quick thing on the corporate side, we have historically invested far less in employee training, I think, on a per capita basis than many other countries. So again, it's, we talk about the productivity crisis. One is the research and development spend, but the other is, okay, even if you get these new technologies like AI, are you even investing in your teams to start using them, right? So there are all these persistent, strong gaps across our society right now: regulatory, literacy, training. And so unless we start doing work in all of those areas, I just think we're going to stay with this trust gap. And then again, the productivity gap, which leads into the sovereignty question. So.
No, this is very interesting because I think that innovation is a leadership competency that we need to explore a whole lot more. The fact that there is an employee-wide upskilling at the moment, it's quite siloized. Not all the C-suite is at the table. And I can say this because I've been a corporate advisor across approximately 50 Fortune 500 organizations over the past few years. I can see the inner workings of what talent and learning actually looks like, what upskilling is actually looking like. It's only happening in certain pockets. And so there's a lot that people can do when it comes to just getting fingers on keyboards to try out prompts, just getting people in the room to hear about how things might work. And while tomorrow isn't promised, the present can actually be really educational and empowering in that regard. So with that, Mark, you're in the hot seat now. No, I'm kidding. You actually the Government of Canada has actually assembled a really interesting AI task force across different disciplines and industries to come together to grapple with a lot of the same questions that we're talking about now. I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of what it's been like and just anything you wanted to share.
Yeah, I mean, I might pick up on some of the conversation that both Ashley and Jackson were commenting on, but essentially Minister Solomon kind of arrived with a pan-Canadian AI strategy that was in mid-flight. It's been in place since 2017. It's been iterated on over the course of multiple kind of injections of government capital. So started as a brains play, was really about shoring up our research capacity, helped create the 3 AI institutes in Mila, in Vector, and in Amy. Created 130 CFAR chairs, 128, I always get it wrong, who have been an extraordinary catalyst for thousands of postdocs and graduate students that have been able to kind of be at the forefront of that. Added significant programming as it related to adoption, commercialization, and then in 2024 added sufficient and significant resources dedicated towards infrastructure. But I think the reality is that the technology and technologies in many ways have moved on and are advancing at a clip that is quite rapid and changing the nature of its deployment and its diffusion and also its relevance. At the same time as the geopolitics has changed, and at the same time as the actual kind of integration within our society and in our economy in terms of the imperative has also shifted. And so Minister Solomon basically took the opportunity to kind of well in advance of the actual end of the Pan-Canadian AI Strategy's existing funding envelope to kind of say, let's take stock and let's actually think about how to do that. And let's not use, as he would put it, 1950s governance mechanisms in place for a 21st century problem. And so let's not send off a blue ribbon panel of a whole bunch of folks to spend the next 8 months preparing a compendium of reading that very few people will actually ingest. Let's actually just act with speed and treat this as an iterative exercise. And so the 30-day national sprint was launched on October 1st. It had a public consultation component and 28 members of a national task force. I think the public consultation component is telling. 11,300 Canadians decided to spend their very valuable time answering government questions
Congratulations on that.
Yeah, which were not short. And
It was not short.
It was not short.
Process.
No. It's all good. I mean, the number of people who completed the whole of the survey is different than the people who submitted an answer. But there's real value in what they've submitted. The 28 members of the task force crossed a whole series of kind of spectrums, and we've actually just spent the last 2 days with them. So the minister and I and our teams have had a chance to be able to engage with the task force members about their reports. Yeah, I mean, a lot of consistent themes, but I think also a recognition that this probably isn't going to be a silver bullet. This probably isn't going to be a one size fits all. So if the answer wasn't just a straight up renewal of everything we've been doing, because the reality is that our results aren't great, whether in trust and confidence or in adoption or in commercialization. The reality is also that the world has changed too, and that we're going to probably need to do some different things. And so, I do think when I think about the culture of innovation that we need to create is like, one big compelling question that we're kind of struggling with is, there's lots you can do at the top of the triangle, and we've spent a lot on the top of the triangle. The very, very tip of the triangle is AGI. We're not really in that space. That's the kind of the reserve for a very limited number of actors who are desperately seeking artificial general intelligence, and even the questions of whether or not they're truly seeking it is an open question depending on the day. And then there's a whole bunch of kind of high touch, can you grow 200 or 500 kind of large-scale AI and AI native companies that potentially are driving either new models or new infrastructure. But the real kind of ball game is in the applications layer, where it's like, where is the mass of the economy and the mass of the society going to engage with, learn about, work with, and ultimately adopt AI capabilities? And that raises all sorts of, challenging questions that my co-panelists have already touched on. But, we have a whole bunch of sectors that I think are reluctant to do so unless it's befitting of their sector. So we're going to need to help some of those sectors actually understand what AI means for them. I think we've got a whole bunch of sectors that have traditionally not needed to feel the part of organic innovation. They didn't need to own any of their new technologies. They could just buy it off the shelf when it came through and kind of implement. And then we've got a whole bunch of citizens that haven't necessarily had access to, either from their employer or otherwise, the kind of skill sets and competencies that are actually changing the nature of work as we go. And so this is a new paradigm in some ways. And there are some very exciting opportunities. So really short kind of example is like, to get to Ashley's point that this isn't like one thing, it's actually many things. Sometimes it's a generative AI tool, sometimes it's literally just basic summarization, sometimes it's an LLM that's just reading your kid a bedtime story, sometimes it's actually like a machine, a learning video model that or a large video model that can actually do really interesting things. And so I think breaking it down, there's a large video model company here in town that blew me away, in that they are a surveillance video technology company. They offer surveillance video for CCTV for most of the kind of retail operations. The scary part, everyone always thinks oh God, surveillance, this is about figuring out who's stealing or who's being lazy at work. But actually the cool analytic part was they have a large retailer. It'll probably be obvious from the example that I give away, which is that has come to the determination that there is massive increase in average per customer spend when the donut case is more than half full. And so if you can actually use a large video model that understands when the donut case has been getting empty because suddenly things look less fresh and less exciting, and so I don't really actually need that second muffin, and that actually can actually generate an analytic response that actually then generates value for the enterprise. These are some of the ways and tools that potentially are going to drive AI value, and they're not all necessarily going to be, concocting a voice-altered Grammy Award winner. It's actually just probably going to be selling more donuts.
So this is awesome, to put it plainly. I think when we talk about practicality, when we talk about the use cases, when we talk about widespread adoption, I think these are the things that make us all really excited. And in this case of 11,300 Canadians responding to the public consultation, we also see that when we properly engage the public, they respond. So the question is how can we continue to do this? To zoom back up, I guess it is, Ashley, I don't think we would have gotten as far as we needed to if we didn't also talk about the laws that we need to see and the regulations that need to be updated and represented. So we haven't talked about what will replace C27 and PIPEDA, so the question is, and this could be a whole panel, what's really required in terms of where we are today? And with that, I know that your organization just released a really astounding digital governance report. So wondering if you can give us some of the highlights and make some recommendations.
Yeah, thank you so much. Mark really should be answering this question. But sure, this is my opportunity to provide my public consultation.
You can dream out loud here.
Professionalization. So I think, a couple of things maybe before getting into the regulation question specifically that I just want to build upon that's going to tie some of this together is that I think back to the question of sovereignty and Canada's role kind of in this current AI ecosystem with the current geopolitical climate in mind, There's a really interesting survey that KPMG did with Queensland in Australia, but it was a global survey on trust. And what's super interesting about it was that they saw that countries that didn't really have other opportunities, even though they might have had lower levels of trust, they still had a higher rate of adoption for AI systems because there might not be public infrastructure to do banking or to get access to medical information. And so I think that, to Jackson's point, we can be small c conservative in a lot of ways, whether it be through our procurement processes or Boy Scouts is what you put it, how you put it. I think that there's a lesson to be learned there in terms of, again, the tone that the government's setting in terms of adoption, to try and use these different types of tools, but in a way that you understand what those implications are. And so having access to tools and resources that people can self-educate or not feel like they're not able to trust those systems, whether it's to get more donuts or whether it's to get the new Neo robot that's going to fold my laundry, even though there
I'll sign
might
up for
be,
that.
Yeah, 2-year-old twins, and they are very, very messy and produce a lot of laundry. And so, but it's a good example actually, because you're thinking about these things through a lens, at least from an informed person that's been working on this for a long time. I was like, a robot in my house that's going to view what we're going to do all of the time. But I looked into it a little bit more, and the people are blurred out. Like, there's a lot of privacy considerations that have been built into this. So now I'm back onto the folding robot train. But still more work needs to be done on it. And so, like, maybe V2 of it. But I think it's a really great example of where, okay, if you're going into something knowing what those risks are, you can make an individual choice for what and when and how you're going to adopt that and under what parameters. I personally refuse to sign the photo consent form for my child's daycare because there's no opt-out, there's no context around it. But having a robot that has operators that people can see, I'm somehow okay with. Anyway, but you as an individual, but also companies then need to be informed enough to make those choices. And I think what regulations do is they help set that tone. And I think that back to what Jackson was mentioning earlier, what our digital governance report found, you were mentioning that was in the Canadian context. I was on that public advisory working group for, public sentiment working group for the previous version of Canada's AI task force, whatever it was called. And so, again, it was important, I think, two things from this. It's important that, independent of what the actual titles are, it's important to have these forums where, whether they're sprints or whether they're blue ribbon commissions, there is some connection that the government's getting feedback from various different industries to understand what those implications are in order to build rules of any type of format. And so whether those are hard rules or soft rules, what our digital governance report found was exactly what we found in the Canadian context in 2021, which was that people want those rules. They want to be able to have a better understanding of how and where it's appropriate for them to use those systems for two reasons, is what we saw. Both just knowing what's acceptable use and feeling that confidence, and then creating appropriate governance measures, including mitigation measures, but also for competition purposes. Like, if it's acceptable that Neo, the one company with the robot, is going to blur the vision and create some privacy preserving components to it, but then another company comes on the market with a different robot made, and it doesn't have that, but people don't necessarily know that or have the competency to do that, they don't have the ability to, they're just going to pick whatever is a lower cost or whatever is easier for them to access in their market. And so it's really, really important that we set, I would say, sectoral and use case specific regulations, so that we're able to then, or rules of some sorts,
in order to be able to increase competition so that Canadian companies are not setting themselves to that higher standard that they're not able to sell into markets across the world that might not have that same tone. And going back to what Mark said earlier, even though we were on this trajectory of harmonization and globalization, recognizing that AI systems don't have these physical boundaries, it's really important that we still think about that from, again, a more nuanced perspective when we're talking about standards, so that Canada can be competitive in other markets and have that adoption, but also still protect Canadians.
I wish we had a whole other hour to go into the competition piece. And I think that will be, maybe that's something we can pick up in the town hall with Vass. That would be great. But I think maybe in the last several minutes we have, I might want to be a bit circular and go back to where we started and ask Jackson, AI has become a new layer of economic and geopolitical infrastructure. But how should we be thinking about AI diplomacy in 2025? It's a very different thing right now. There's kind of the mainstream intergovernmental work that has to be done. There's also, the quieter pieces that can be done. And I'm just wondering what you think it should look like for a middle power like Canada, given the world has shifted quite a bit and nothing is really lining up as we thought it would.
Okay, this is a super fun question. I'm very happy to get it. I don't know if my mic is still on. I remember I read a book in university. It was Amartya Sen. I think he's a Nobel Prize-winning development economist. I might get this title wrong, but it's either development is freedom or freedom is development. But the general thrust being, how do we actually, in the course of development, actually enable more freedoms, economic and political, for people? When I think about AI diplomacy, Mark mentioned that this kind of broad international consensus we were working on, in some ways, has kind of fallen apart. That doesn't mean like the pursuit is over. Right, and what it means is the mechanisms, the vehicles have changed, and so when I think about something tangible, right? Lots of countries, they do want to chart their own course, their own sovereign AI future. They may not have the resources to do so, and in the most recent budget, something was interesting. Canada is pulling back its international aid commitments to a historical level. It's part of a broad cost-cutting measure happening across government, but of course, that's happening in the context of USAID falling apart, and we've lost $80 billion of stuff that was helping people afford food, helping afford basic economic development. And so in light of that, are there asymmetric things that we could do that'd be more helpful to people? I had this amazing experience last summer where I actually went to Senegal and I was touring around for a couple of weeks and I got to meet actually some of the smartest young data scientists who are being trained there. They're building their own AI compute facilities, like this very cool integrated campus. They've got so much talent there, but of course don't have nearly the same economic opportunities that lots of Canadians would have. And so what I think about is, what is AI as development? Like, what does that actually look like? And I think development can be very much a part of diplomacy and about trade, right? The US and China absolutely do that. The Belt and Road Initiative, the USAID, that was a huge part of what they actually do. It's this economic diplomacy measure. And so what I think about for Canada, it's can we leverage AI compute multilaterally? Can that be a shared resource? Can we build that up with partners like the UK and Australia, trusted partners, so they have trusted AI that's not owned by one of two imperial powers globally. And that could actually be really useful. It could be trusted medium for a lot of countries to build their own digital and AI realities, right? So that's one thing I think about is the compute side. The second is I think about our talent. We have some of the best, most talented AI researchers and thinkers in the world here. How do we help more of those people to build their careers in Canada, and the ones we do have, we retain them, and then ideally help them to do more work abroad? Why are we not doing, delegations where we go abroad and we try and share that talent, share that expertise? And the Americans have laid out this vision that is their AI action plan. It's very much American AI dominance all around the world. They want to be unchallenged. I dispute that notion. I think that it can be challenged, but it has to be challenged in very smart ways. We are able to do that. We just have to pick. We can't do everything, right? We just don't have the resources. And so let's figure out, what are our top 3 to 5 swim lanes? Let's go and do that. It's a process of, again, industrial development, but stuff that can have very, very positive aspects for our trade partners, especially in developed countries and around the world. So that's what I think about. How can we use AI to give more freedom to people around the world? We have the expertise to do it. And I think that could be really cool. And I also would step on other people's toes. I think just the fact that if AI is developed in Canada, it will be better from a democratic perspective, from a values-based perspective. We've got a lot of work we can do. We can always improve the way we do things, but generally, I think our values are better than a lot of other imperial powers' values, right? I think we are more tolerant, we are more pluralistic, and so we should be proud of that. We should turn that into something we can use diplomatically.
I think that's a very powerful closing sentence, and I think you're absolutely right. So with a couple of minutes to go, I want to say thank you to the panelists, because what I think you've done is really open up a series of conversations and trajectories that everyone in the room can carry forward. And with that, I do want to open up to questions for the audience. Please go right ahead. Who's first? Maybe this.
We'd like to just start with a question from the virtual crowd first.
Oh, okay, we're going to do a virtual question first, and then we'll come over to you, okay?
And then we'll get to you guys. So the question is, the early research on generative AI LLMs appears to be showing that the effect on business and office productivity is negative rather than the widely expected positive. In addition, many economic analysts now believe that we are in a financial AI bubble that is likely to crash soon. I don't hear a lot of recognition of these emerging danger signs in the talks today. Is the government taking notice of these warnings, especially in terms of where and how we are making our investments? So that's the first one, and I'll take some other questions.
Would you like to?
Do you want me? Sure, I'll reply to that one to start. So I mean, I think there's actually a couple of interesting things at play. So one is AI value and return on investment is driven by adoption, and adopting right now is mostly felt at the broadest level of kind of user-generated query for the most part. So what we're actually seeing, by and large, is back office applications, enterprise tools, and a number of kind of broad-scale utilizations of generative tools that are mostly consumer-facing, and when they have been adopted in enterprise contexts, have usually been at the I wouldn't say margins, but I would say at the earliest kind of opportunities for being able to replicate existing task-based functions. A couple of things that I think are notable about that. One is very few workplaces actually have people who are solely dedicated towards the back office applications that are being replicated by generative tools, which means that the lack of return on investment should be unsurprising in some ways to us, because actually it means that the efficiency of a given task of a portion of a person is actually getting better. But that's actually not necessarily going to result in wide-scale ROI in the short term. The other kind of academic literature suggests that the early return on investment, particularly in enterprise settings, actually accrues to the individual. It actually doesn't accrue to the enterprise. And that's partially because of how we measure and also how we assign tasks. So I can give you a government example, which is we have a parliamentary summarization tool that was deployed in a number of departments. Two different tools, one developed by our colleagues at Housing and Infrastructure, one developed at ISED, one that did a summarization of every parliamentary committee appearance, because PCO requires us to send one in a timely fashion. And so lots and lots of summaries of me at committee. And then the other was a prep tool that essentially went through Hansard to be able to identify potential areas for questioning. What that saves is, on the summarization tool in particular, 4 hours of a parliamentary affairs analyst's time in what they would normally do, watching and then summarizing. Well, those 4 hours are now within the domain of that individual. They get to decide what it is that they're going to apply those 4 hours to that is more valuable than what they would have done writing the summary. I'm not suggesting that the answer to this is that we should move towards controlling and understanding every single minute of every single parliamentary analyst's day, but I will say that right now those 4 hours are probably accruing value in ways that we're not tracking. So that's my comments on value. On bubble, I would just say this is part of the reason why we are being very thoughtful about ensuring that we are building out the kinds of levels of compute and the generalized amount of compute that actually is commensurate with what we think our needs are, as opposed to kind of imagining that we're in a world where we will be a brute force user of overall compute capacity.
Jax, I know you wanted to make a quick comment, but I want to make sure we get to this lady as well. So do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, it's just super rapid fire. So one is on that first question, I think that study being quoted or referenced is the MIT one. There are some limitations to that study. I think it was 95% of pilots fail or don't show ROI. That was with a number of large corporations. A lot of those use cases are not necessarily high impact use cases. I'm not surprised it didn't show ROI. I think it's worth looking at some of the limitations of that study. Second is on the bubble. Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing components of a bubble. That's okay. We saw it for the internet as well. It didn't mean that it wasn't a massive general purpose technology that was still useful for society. I think what it might mean is a lot of private companies or investors may lose a lot of money, but the net societal benefit that could come from the deployment of the tech doesn't mean that we don't see it. It's kind of like internet and fiber networks, right? These things still proliferate and propagate, and we're useful from a collective standpoint.
Thank you for that. And can we go over here? And then I think, are we? Yeah. Then we'll be out of time.
Yeah, okay. I'd like to circle back just briefly to the first panel, which talked about the values that should be governing our approach to digital sovereignty. I'd really be interested to hear from the panelists, as well as from Madame Desrochers, what values do you think should be governing the adoption of AI by the Government of Canada? I've heard a lot of details about specific applications, including selling more donuts, but surely there must be a higher level of priorities that we have that are in mind when we develop policies for adoption of AI.
Yeah, it's important to note that the donut example is a commercial example, not a Government of Canada example. Government of Canada is not in the donut selling business. Yet. Well, if there's but I'd say, well, first of all, I think public service adoption needs to be rooted in public service values. And so we actually have public service values, which include fairness and excellence, two ones that I think are super important. Value for money and generally probity are important pieces. And so I think those are some of the kind of the determinations. I think when we're looking at potential use cases as well as the kind of overall kind of effort to adopting AI in the public service, transparency is super critical, has been throughout, including also on the private sector side. I think ensuring that they've been understood for their capacity for harm, including for bias and discrimination, I think is really critical. And it actually comes down in many ways to the policies we have around data stewardship in general, because AI is only as good as the data that you're using to drive it and the business process that you're putting it on. And if those are broken, then it will fail. And so I think it just reminds us of that.
So I think want to add very, very quickly that we shouldn't reinvent the wheel here. Canada's been very, very involved in trying to set a values-based approach to the adoption of AI that will be beneficial to society. And so that is in the form of the OECD principles, and there's been a lot of work done around that. So I think that, again, whether that is facilitated through legislation or through standards development or other types of soft legislation or soft rules, this is something that I think we always need to hearken back to, and Canada should continue to play an important role as those continue to be developed through different types of applications or commercial uses.
And I think, unfortunately, with that, we're out of time. So I encourage you to continue forward your questions during the break, and just thank you for such an animated discussion all around. Thank you.